this lesson, I want us to delve into the mysteries of game systems. What are they, and how can we use them to create the games we want our players to experience? A role-playing game system is basically just a set of game mechanics that are used in a tabletop role-playing game in order to determine the outcomes of a character in-game action. In order to understand the component of a game system, we must understand two things: game mechanics and the game loop. A game mechanic is a method we use to determine the outcomes of actions taken by characters in the game. This can be something as simple as a roll of the dice or the use of a specific resource, like mana points. Role-play game mechanics may include a variety of conflict resolution methods. An example for this in D&D 5th edition may be when dice are rolled to make an ability check versus a target number. Some game mechanics require the use of finite resources. In 5th edition, for example, bards receive the resource called Bardic Inspiration that can be used a certain number of times per day. In the Fate role-playing system, Fate points are a resource that can be used to generate immediate outcome in the game. The game loop, on the other hand, represents the order of the different phases that take place during the game. For example, the basic game loop for most role-playing games is: first, the game master describes the situation that the characters are in. Then, the player contemplates their options and describe what actions their characters are taking. Next, game mechanics are used to determine the results of these actions. And finally, once the results are clear, the game master describes the outcome of the actions and start the game loop over by describing the new situation that has arisen based on those outcomes. The game loop is all about how the game master and players interact to play the game, while the game mechanics are used within game loops to determine the results of specific in-game actions. Now that we understand the concept of the basic game loop and game mechanic, we can start thinking about the events of our gaming sessions in two categories: the game loop, which is how we interact with our players around the table, and the game mechanic, which is how we reflect those real-world interactions inside the game. If you played more than one kind of a role-playing game, you probably noticed that game systems can be very different from each other. Each game system has its own unique take on the game loop and the game mechanic. Let's look at a few and try to see what similarities and differences, as well as strengths and weaknesses, we can spot right off the bat. Dungeons & Dragons is a high fantasy role-playing game centered around the idea of adventuring parties fighting evil monsters, gaining treasure, and earning experience. This system is mainly designed for players who wish to defeat their opponents, to carefully manage their resources, and use their abilities to overcome challenges. And of course, you can use this system for other styles of narrative. You can tell heartfelt stories of character development and personal drama while still using the D&D game loop and mechanics. But the system itself has little support for these kind of stories. And by support, I mean that D&D 5th edition provides a limited number of game mechanics to support this specific playstyle. The Fate system, on the other hand, provides game mechanics that focus on supporting storytelling and drama, but has a much lower power curve than that found in D&D 5th edition. As characters advance in Fate, they do not get more powerful. Fate is more about creating interesting stories and characters, and about having those characters interact with each other. Players playing Fate have more narrative control than players in other gaming systems. One of the mechanics that support giving narrative control to the players is called Fate Points, a game resource which players can use to gain narrative control over the story or over other player characters. For example, if James, one of our players, describes their character as someone with a history of alcoholism, and the game master describes a scene where some NPCs are drinking wine, a player can use up one of their fate points to compel James' character to abandon their current mission and be led astray because of their addiction. And this is not some obscure rule. This is a core game mechanic that allows and encourages players to perform these actions in-game. The Dread RPG system uses a very different kind of interesting mechanic, a Jenga Tower. Every time you perform a dangerous action, you take away one brick from the Jenga Tower. When the tower collapses, something terrible happens. This mechanics relies heavily on the abilities of the player rather than the character to determine when something catastrophic happens in-game. While this could be seen as a disadvantage, another way of looking at it would be that the game system does not limit what the characters can attempt to do. One of the most important aspects in Dread is that the game system itself builds tension. As the game progresses, we know that every action we do might have dire consequences. One way of playing, which I haven't mentioned yet, is called playing free-form games. Free-form games are games with a very limited set of rules. The idea when playing this kind of games is that we want to focus on the narrative we are creating, and that we do not want any game mechanics to determine the scope of the actions we can take. Free-form games can be played as a group of friends telling a story, or it could include rolling dice, where high is good and low is bad, and that's all the rules you need. Why are these distinctions important? Because using the right game system makes it easier for you to play the game you want to play. It's possible to run an episodic high school romance RPG using Dungeons and Dragons, but the mechanics of the system don't really fit with that kind of story. It would make more sense to use the Fate system. Alternatively, you wouldn't want to use the Fate system to run a game where you want to build mechanically optimized fighters. D&D would be a better choice. Choosing the right game system is an important part of running a game you all enjoy. Different game systems define different game loops and use different game mechanics that lead us toward specific game experiences. Identifying the desired experience and picking a game system accordingly will ensure that you will play the game best suited for you and your players. In this course, we will be focusing on tips, tricks, and examples that are suitable for most tabletop role-playing games. But we will use the 5th edition of Dungeons & Dragons as our go-to system for examples. In fact, the one-shot that you will build as your final project would be using this system. This is mainly because it's the most common role-playing game system and can serve as a common denominator amongst Greatwyrm Games students. Since Dungeons & Dragons is going to be our game system of choice for the course, let's talk a bit more about what styles of play the mechanics and game loop of D&D best supports. Like we've mentioned, D&D is a game geared toward high fantasy adventures, featuring heroes and monsters, magic and loot, and a set of complicated rules that govern most in-game interactions. A D&D game is built around elements called the 3 pillars. These are combat, exploration, and social interaction. A D&D adventure will likely include some mixture of all 3. If you want to learn more about Dungeons & Dragons, head over to Wizards of the Coast website and read up. They have excellent starter sets for new players. How much of each pillar is the right amount? Well, it's different for every game group. Notice what your players enjoy, check in with them from time to time, and experiment. Over time, you will discover what your players enjoy the most, and you can mix elements from the 3 pillars accordingly. And don't forget about the sources of enjoyment that we discussed in Lesson 1 of this chapter. Within each of the 3 pillars of D&D can be found many opportunities to mix and match different aspects of enjoyment. A combat encounter can have a 3D terrain using many miniatures. This caters to players who love using paraphernalia. Combat may also be closely tied to an ongoing plot, making players who enjoy narrative development happy. And finally, the combat may require difficult tactical thinking due to different terrain and challenges, which scratches the itch of the more tactically inclined players in your group. See how game systems influence the way we approach games? Now, armed with this understanding, we encourage you to go out and experiment. Try different game systems to find the ones you connect with and enjoy. Who knows, you might surprise yourself and your players.